Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Brownbag seminar brought to you by SDCC and the Transport Sector Group. So today the question in front of us is Asia closing the transport infrastructure gap? So that's a big question, of course. The way we are going to look at it is by trying to follow historical patterns of transport development and see what would happen. So this brown bag will provide a description of the Asian transport sector and how it could likely evolve in the next decade. And this is informed from the transport data and policy information collected as part of the Asian Transport Outlook initiative. The presentation will provide a comprehensive overview and try to conclude if continuing historical trends could result into bridging gaps for the transport sector. And to answer all these questions, we have today with us our speaker, Sudhir Gota. Sudhir, you specialize on environmental issues related to the transport sector. You are the principal co-architect of the ADB's Transport Outlook, and you have provided training to many guests in many cities in many parts of the world, and also published a few papers, including the one on the Transport and Paris Agreement that received international acknowledgement. So today, Sudhir, as I mentioned, you are going to talk to us about the transport sector gap in Asia in 2030.
Thank you, Burton. Good morning and good afternoon. Is Asia, what is the gap, transport sector gap in 2030? So we have very good stories from the Asian Transport Outlook. Now, what is Asian Transport Outlook? Asian Transport Outlook is an initiative started by ADB 3 years back, and the main objective is to improve access to the data. But it is just not about improving access to data, but it is also about translating the data into insights, policies, and investments. We consider multiple dimensions of the transport sector, looking at infrastructure, transport activity and services, access, air pollution, road safety, climate change, and the economic dimension of the transport sector. We look at nearly 51 economies, nearly 460 cities. We have data from more than 1,000 projects, transport projects, in terms of what are the costs of various infrastructure components. We have information or insights on data, on policies, on institutional framework, and we have multiple knowledge products coming out of with the data. So one of the assessments what we carried out last year was to see the transport progress on the Sustainable Development Goals using historic data. And what we found was, if you look at the transport sector, you would realize that transport sector doesn't have a dedicated goal in the SDGs process, the Sustainable Development Goals process, but transport is considered as a facilitator of many of the goals. If you look at the progress now, by 2020, we consider that transport has made a very limited progress in terms of the various 17 goals. As you are aware, that the SDG goals are slightly vague, and they don't provide an exact definition of what that goal is. So this is a little bit of qualitative assessment of how the progress is. And what we found was, for majority of the dimensions of the SDG goals, we have made very limited progress. Now the question is, if we have made limited progress, what is the outlook for 2030? And that was the main question which we tried to answer using Asian Transport Outlook. So how do we make the projections? We make the projections using the methodology, or our approach is to beg, borrow, and model. We try to collect, because it's a very small component, our outlook is a very small component of the Asian Transport Outlook process. We don't spend a lot of resources on it. But what we do is to find out what others have projected on transport sector in along the various dimensions. We collect it. We then try to consider historic relationships between different components, try to model, use existing models, global models, what we can find, and then try to validate it with external, with other models. So we considered our projection, we call it as a reference scenario. What is this reference scenario? Our reference scenario is we don't say what will happen. We don't say what should happen, but we only try to see what could happen. So basically, it's possible that the trends play out in this particular manner. So what we do is we collect a lot of data. We have already collected nearly indicators, nearly 500 indicators from 51 economies. We have considered policy insights from nearly 437 policy documents. What we do is we collect all the data. We collect the projections which has been carried out by other reputable institutions. We consider them, and then we try to model the various dimensions of the transport sector using those growth rates and try to compare it with historical relationships globally between, say, for example, road fatalities and road length, or road fatalities with income. And after establishing these relationships, what we try to do is we use existing models like SafeFits, for example, which has been developed by UNECE, and then we try to validate it with some of the other projections by International Energy Agency and the other reputable institutions. So what are the various stories what we are seeing? Let us start with the infrastructure now, transport infrastructure. Is there a gap? Yes, there is a gap. As per the SDG progress, we have seen that there is a significant gap. So what is the outlook? We find that over the next 10 years, now, if you look historically, Asia is building road kilometers at a faster rate. Between 2000 to 2010, we added about 3.7 million kilometers of total of the infrastructure, road infrastructure. Between 2010 to 2020, we added 5.7 million kilometers. Now, if we consider the historical construction rates to go up, continue further, we think that probably 8 million kilometers could be added between 2020 to 2030. So Asia's road infrastructure could increase from about 21 million to about 29 million. We also try to do elastic regression with income and try to see globally what could be the scenario. We found that we are making conservative estimate. We are not really making very over projections or making very optimistic projections for this. With record increase in the road transport infrastructure, how is Asia compared to the other regions? We think that overall Asia has about 4.1 meters of 4.1 meters of road infrastructure in terms of meters per capita now, 4.1. Africa is about 4.4. So probably we are at the level of Africa right now. And even by 2030, we would be about nearly 6 meters per capita. So in terms of road infrastructure, we have limited infrastructure, and it will remain the same even after constructing record kilometers of road infrastructure. What is important to understand is that here population density also plays a major role. As the population density increases, the road infrastructure requirement decreases. So if you look at high income economies in Asia, we have about 10 meters to 11 meters compared to Europe and US of 15 to 16 meters per capita. So, but still infrastructure will be added, and road infrastructure will still increase going forward. Okay, now if you look at railways, what is the scenario? Railways, over the next 10 years, we predict that probably 78,000 kilometers of railway infrastructure would be added. But this would be comparatively lower than what Asia has added over the last 10 years, which is about 91,000 kilometers. So while we are a little bit optimistic with the road, with the railways, we are not that optimistic. We carried out global regressions to see whether we have already reached the saturation rate. We have not reached the saturation rate. We are a little bit pessimistic with the railways just because if you look at all the projects in Asia which have gone for tendering and which have gone for the execution, we could count only 18,000 kilometers of railway infrastructure projects right now, which are under design and construction. Only 15 Asian economies have developed railway master plans. So there is a chance that we might build less kilometers of railway compared to what we have built over 2010 to 2020. One of the reasons why Asia added 91,000 kilometers in the last decade was the response to global economic financial crisis in 2008. China built massive kilometers of railway infrastructure. And maybe after COVID, it remains to be seen whether Asian countries also prioritize railway infrastructure and start building railways at the record scale. But there would be still significant railway gap in terms of the infrastructure compared to some of the best economies in the world. This infrastructure gap would still remain by 2030, unfortunately. Now, in terms of the high-speed rail, we see the same story. By 2030, we think that probably 70,000 kilometers of total infrastructure of high-speed rail would be there. The good news is, what we thought 10 years back, if you look at the IEA's 2013 estimate for the global, they projected that nearly 35,000 kilometers of high-speed railways would be added till 2025. Asia has added the similar stuff in the last 10 years. So we have actually built record kilometers of railway from 2010 to 2020, 33,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, mainly in China. But what we are seeing now is the translation of the experience from China and Japan to the rest of the Asian economies, and still we will build about 28,000 kilometers. Now, how did we project this? We looked at all the high-speed railway projects which are currently under execution, and we collected this insight from one of our partners under the Asian Transport Outlook, which is UIC. Recently, last week, UIC published the latest atlas. And the current trend is, as per the estimate what we had, there is 3,000 kilometers less, but yeah, around 28,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. And what we are finding interesting is that Asia is building high-speed rail at the lowest GDP per capita compared to the other parts of the world. So because of the experience from China and Japan, we are actually seeing that India, Indonesia, and Thailand over the next couple of years would add high-speed rail at the lowest GDP per capita. This point, you have to consider it with the environmental implications, which is CO2 emissions. I will come back to this a little bit later because it has a very big role to play in the climate change mitigation. Now, let us consider urban rapid transit, which is basically metro, LRT lines, and the BRT lines. What do we see? The good news is that over the next 10 years, we will build the same infrastructure which we have built over the last 20 years. Over the next 10 years, we will add massive kilometers of urban transit lines. 75% of these urban transit lines would be in form of metro. So we see massive construction of metros happening in Asia, and we have actually taken the metro projections by looking at execution numbers, saying that how many projects are currently under pipeline and in execution. And what we find is from 2000 to 2010, Asia added nearly 3,100 kilometers of urban transit line in terms of metro, LRT, and BRT. In 2010 to 2020, cumulatively, we added 7,100 kilometers. Over the next 10 years, we project that we will add 11,500 kilometers of urban transit lines. The good news is that we have an infrastructure in terms of the access. We have about 6 kilometers per million urban population. This is the number which European Union had about 1980s in terms of the numbers, but at a GDP per capita which is significantly higher than Asia. If our projections hold true, Asia would be having about 9.8 kilometers per million urban population, close to 10. And the gap between Asia and Europe would be only 10 years. What Europe has now, we will have the same access by 2030. So this is actually a good news. Now the question is, have we hit peak motorization? Now, why is I'm even talking about peak motorization. If you look at the car sales over the last 5 years, what we are seeing is a very interesting trend that car sales have started decreasing. Oh, and this is not because of COVID. This is the data which is from 2009 to 2019. Basically, from 2015 onwards, we see that the car sales across the globe is falling down. And so some of the researchers have started asking this question: has Asia reached peak motorization? The answer is no. If you look at the global trade of vehicles over the last 2 years until 2020, the vehicle which has increased in terms of the trade is 2 and 3 wheelers. In Asia, 50% of the vehicles are 2 and 3 wheelers. So basically what we are seeing is we still see an increase in the number of vehicles. However, the good news is that increase is not what we used to think 10 years back. The vehicle increase is happening slower, but nevertheless, it will increase. So if you look at from 2000 to 2010, we added about 330 million vehicles onto the road. From 2010 to 2020, 620 million vehicles. So right now, we project that there are nearly 1.2 billion vehicles on Asian roads. 1.2. In 2000, it was only 200 million. So we added 1 billion vehicles over the last 20 years. By next 10 years, by 2030, we think that we will have about 1.6 billion vehicles on Asian roads. 50% of these vehicles would be 2 and 3 wheelers. Now, if you go back 10 years and if you see the literature which was churned out, many researchers, many experts thought that as GDP per capita of Asia would exceed beyond $3,000, people will start buying cars and people will stop using 2 and 3 wheelers. What we are realizing is that Asia's love for 2 and 3 wheelers is not subsiding. It is still continuing with that. Even with higher GDP per capita, we think that people will still use 2 and 3 wheelers, though car numbers will increase. But Asia is not abandoning 2 and 3 wheelers. So it has a slightly positive effect on the climate change. But nevertheless, the vehicle numbers will increase, the congestion will increase. What is the bad news? The bad news is that the public transport vehicles per capita will decrease. What we are seeing is as countries become rich, the bus or the public transport vehicles, if you consider jeepneys and FX and all the other high occupancy vehicles, it starts decreasing as the income levels increase. Between 2000 to 2010, we added 3 million public transport vehicles in our fleet. From 2010 to 2020, we added 6 million. Why? Mainly because of Indonesia and India, which had urban renewal programs. There was massive subsidy provided for purchase of the buses and the other public transport vehicles. However, because of increase in the shared mobility, we think that countries would not prefer a lot of buses. This is what the projections are showing. Basically, that Asians might end up buying less buses. If you look at the global trade of buses, if you look at how the import and export of buses is happening, we already see a dramatic decrease since 2016 in terms of the bus exports and imports. This is a worrisome trend. If countries don't prioritize buses, what could be the implication onto the public transport lines? So, yeah, we see some contrast in the vehicle ownership patterns. The sales of the cars slightly decreasing, 2 and 3 wheelers increasing, buses slightly decreasing. So what is the implication on the demand? Basically, transport demand and access gap. Now, in terms of passenger kilometers, we predict that probably from 16 trillion passenger kilometers in 2020, we will increase it to about 22 trillion passenger kilometers. So basically, over the next 10 years, we think that probably 5 million trillion kilometers of passenger kilometer travel would be added. So in terms of per capita levels, where are we? As of now, we think that probably 3,600 kilometers per capita in a year, a person travels in Asia, 3,600 kilometers. By 2030, it would be about 4,200. So the demand is increasing. What is interesting, it is that we are going to add 5 trillion passenger kilometers. But in terms of freight, there is a very bad news. The amount of freight growth what we are seeing over the next 10 years is what we had over the last 20 years. This massive growth, if you look at the historical relationships, we have reached a GDP per capita where countries start increasing the freight activity at a rapid pace. And if these projections, if the historical relationships hold true, you will see that from 22 trillion freight ton kilometers, we will reach about 36 trillion ton kilometers by 2030. 36 trillion. In terms of per capita levels, this is about 5,000 ton kilometers per capita to about 7,600 ton kilometers per capita. Massive increase in the freight activity. In terms of per capita levels, if you look at passenger transport, we are still, like, for example, Asia has about 60% of the global population, but in terms of the passenger demand, we are about 30%. If you look at per capita levels, even by 2030, we would be traveling lower than what Latin Americans do or what Europeans and the Americans do. In terms of freight, because of China, massive growth over the last 10 years in China, in terms of freight activity, we are slightly ahead of Latin America currently. And by 2030, we will massive increase of freight activity. But still, in terms, I would say that there is, in terms of the demand, there is still a gap. We still have a significant gap. Even with higher disposable incomes, people will travel more. Fortunately or unfortunately, this will have a tremendous impact on the externalities. In terms of the mode shift, what do we see? Is the mode shift happening in Asia? Unfortunately, we don't see significant to good trends here. More or less, the modal shift, we see that rail is losing modal shift to roads. And as you have seen, roads is being constructed at a record scale. Rail is not matching the road infrastructure increase. So we see slightly decrease of rail infrastructure. And in terms of the demand, it has an implication. So what we are seeing is more or less the mode shift, there is no mode shift happening in Asia. Over the last 10 years, many Asian countries had established mode shift policies. They had established modal shift targets. Unfortunately, we are not meeting those targets yet. So we don't see significant shift towards public transport, towards better modes. So that shift is not happening. Now let us talk about rural access. When we spoke about Asia constructing roads at a massive scale, one of the reasons is the rural access or lack of rural access in Asia. In 2020, we estimated that nearly 560 million population in Asia do not have rural access, or they are staying away from a all-weather road of more than 2 kilometers. So by 75% of rural access index currently we have, and by 2030 there will be a marginal improvement. So by 2030 we think that probably 515 million population would be without rural access. So from 560 we have managed to reduce it to 515. It doesn't meet the SDG goal. There is only marginal improvement. World Bank previously had quantified that if countries spend 1% of the GDP on rural access, only on improving rural access, the rural access could improve by nearly 13%. So how does transport compare with other sectors? This is a very interesting question. Over the last 10 years, if you look at electricity, access to clean cooking, and access to internet, we see that other sectors have made tremendous improvement over the last 10 years. For example, in terms of the electricity access, over the last 10 years, 77% of the population have, there is an improvement in access to electricity. 30 to 40% improvement in access to clean cooking and access to internet. However, we will increase the rural access rates by only 1%. It has an implication not only on the passenger transport, but also on the freight transport, because agriculture supply chain, the amount of wastage, what happens in the agriculture supply chains, this is very, very important that the access has to be improved. And access, it is not just about infrastructure, it is about transport services also. So what is the future? Now, moving from access and demand, let us talk about road safety. What do we see? If you look at the last 10 years, we see that many Asian countries have actually made a progress on road safety. For majority of the countries in Asia, road accident fatality rates have increased at a lower rate compared to the population, which is actually a good news. So something seems to be working for majority of the Asian countries. But still, few countries, the road accident fatalities are increasing at a higher rate compared to the population. So what do we see by 2030? Now, if we do all kinds of analysis, if we build all kind of relationships with income, with road length, with transport activity, if we use the best model in the world, which is UNECE SafeFits model, we see a reduction, which is the good news. We see that road accident fatality levels, would decrease from around 800,000 by 2016 to about 600,000 by 2030. This is a good news, but this is only 20% reductions. SDG says that there should be 50% reduction. If you look at the latest World Bank study on global burden of diseases, you see that road safety fatality rates have started going down. So what we see is that there is marginal improvement which is happening on road safety side, but still in terms of economic damage, it is still 4% of the GDP by 2030. Still 600,000 people will be dying on roads every year by 2030. So in a way, we have made quite limited progress, I would say. So moving from fatalities now, let us talk about carbon emissions. Whether the glass is half full or half empty. What we are noticing is that the carbon emissions, or basically the carbon emissions, the CO2 emissions in transport has grown at a rate lower than the transport demand growth rates. And what we have already seen is that transport demand growth rates are lower than the GDP per capita. So what we are seeing is a relative decoupling, means carbon emissions from transport is increasing at a slower rate compared to the income levels. So what we think is probably in 2020, we had about 2.8 million tons of CO2 emissions from transport sector in Asia. We think that by 2030, it would be about 3.5. If I have to extend this trend to 2050, this would be about 4 gigatons. Now, if you look at the historical estimates done by the different agencies, if 2008, we predicted that the transport CO2 emissions growth rate between 2000 to 2030 would be about 5%. Now we are saying that it would be only about 3%. What it means is that people are becoming a little bit more optimistic with the chances of the transport sector. Over the years, pessimists are being converted into optimists, and people have started realizing that transport has a lot of mitigation potential, and some of the policies seems to be working in the transport sector. If you look at the historical rates, if you look at the projections which were carried out in Asia before 2015, and if you aggregate those projections, we think at that point of time, we thought that by 2050, we would have about 7 gigatons of emissions by 2050. Now, we think that it would be not 7 gigaton, but it would be about 4 gigaton, looking at the improvement rates in different countries because of the slow growth in the vehicle population and because of the electrification which seems to be happening. 4 gigatons. Now, for Paris Agreement and for the net zero scenarios and which various countries are implementing, for the 1.5 degree assessment, we need to be below 1 gigaton by 2050. So there still remains a big emission gap which needs to be fulfilled from 4 gigaton to 1.5 gigaton. One more interesting trend what we see is in terms of the modeling assessments being carried out and the low carbon policies. If you look at the second figure, if you look at the green line are the cumulative transport carbon emission mitigation policies, basically transport climate change policies. And what we see is significant increase since 2015. But if you look at all the modeling studies, they had peaked much earlier. So there is a gap. There is a gap in terms of the policies, how the policies are being framed, and what data and the models they are using. The red line indicates the data and the models which influences these policies. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the policies which are being framed are using the models which were done pre-Paris Agreement or pre-SDG era. So maybe they are not ambitious enough in terms of the mitigation potential. And in terms of the total policies also, we see the same trend. We see that while the majority of the policies on climate change have increased post 2015, majority of the infrastructure policies, majority of the policies on modal shift are pre-2015. So basically, we are not really optimizing our policies. The policies are not getting translated from climate change towards the other parts and parcel of the transport sector. So what is the good news in terms of the climate change or in terms of the carbon emissions from the transport sector? First, railways. We see absolute decoupling of railway emissions in spite of Asia adding more infrastructure, in spite of Asia, people traveling on railways. And this is mainly because of electrification of railway lines. Currently, 54% of the Asia's rail lines are already electrified. Massive growth in China, India, and Russia. And what we are also seeing is that because of this electrification, we see significant reductions in the carbon emissions going forward in spite of increase in the infrastructure and in spite of increase in the demand. The second good news, the slide is not here. What we see is the absolute decoupling of high-income economies in Asia. High-income economies in Asia have started absolute decoupling of emissions. And by 2030, we think that if you look at the high-income countries in Asia, their carbon emissions would be 6% below COVID levels. That is 2020. So there is some good news also within the transport sector. So when we look at this railway decoupling and we think about the high-speed rail and the infrastructure increase in the railways, there is a very good solution available for the policymakers in Asia for the intercity transport decarbonization, which seems to be slightly difficult. Now let us come to the air pollution part of it. Do we see any good news? Yes, we see good news. Now many of us think that transport is the biggest contributor to transport air pollution. In many of the countries now, transport is not the biggest source. The latest Lancet study, which considered the source apportionment of different of the transport sector in different cities, transport was not even among the top 3 major contributors. Over a period of time, because of the vehicle emission standards and because of the clean fuel policies, because of lowering of the sulfur limits, while the CO2 emissions have increased, the PM10 levels and the black carbon emissions have started decreasing. The SO2, the sulfur oxide levels have also started decreasing. Only in terms of the NOx, we don't see significant reductions. But going forward, because of the Euro 6 standards in China and India, basically you will see radical change. And many of the ASEAN countries also seems to be moving towards Euro 4. And as the electric vehicles start getting penetrated in the transport sector, air pollution levels will significantly go down. But still, of course, we can actually strengthen the air pollution reduction policies and we can reduce this externality because the highest number of people prematurely dying because of air pollution from transport sector in the world is in Asia. So still, we can improve this. So now the most important question, because ADB is more interested in financing now. In terms of the infrastructure gap, in terms of the demand gap, what do we see in terms of the infrastructure investments? So what we did was, we took the infrastructure component of it, and then we considered the cost of infrastructure. Now, in this particular slide, you see different studies using in different infrastructure costs. So we wanted to standardize it. So what we collected was about 1,000 projects in Asia. What is the infrastructure cost in constructing a new road or a new railway line or a metro line, and how much is required for the maintenance part of it. So we collected this information from nearly 1,000 projects. From this, we derived defaults for high-income economies, middle-income economies, and low-income economies, low and middle-income economies. And then what we did was we imposed it with the increase in the infrastructure. Now we see a very interesting trend with regards to the infrastructure investments. We believe that if that infrastructure has to be increased, Asia would be spending about 1.6% of the GDP over the next 10 years, every year. That is about cumulative 14.5 trillion US dollars over the next 10 years. In terms of annual, this is about 1.5 trillion US dollars every year. In terms of per capita levels, this is about $177 per capita in 2000 to 2010. From 2010 to 2020, it was about $260. Now $300 per capita. But majority of the investments are going towards construction and not on asset management, because Asia, over a period of time, don't spend much on the maintenance part of it. So 86% on the construction part, only 14% of the asset on the maintenance part of it. So only 14%. Roads constitute a significant chunk of the investment, which is about 2/3, 66%. 85% of the total infrastructure investment will happen in East and South Asia. So two sub-regions will absorb nearly 85% of the total in transport sector investments. Now, let us try to conclude the different strands of the stories. We saw in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the access, in terms of the demand, in terms of the road safety, in terms of the air pollution, in terms of the climate change, and in terms of the financing, or in terms of the infrastructure investment requirements. Basically, the transport outlook, if you look at the historic trends, and if you look at if those historic trends will continue in the future, we see an infrastructure gap, we see demand and access gap. Still by 2030, there will be significant chunk of people without rural access. There will be significant technology gap, there is policy gap, and there is the investment gap. So it would be very, very difficult for Asia to transform its infrastructure and transform its mobility going by 2030. I believe that there are some good stories there, but in terms of the outlook, it is not very optimistic for us. If the trends continue like this, we will make only limited progress. And majority of the SDG goals, we will not reach those SDG goals if these historic trends continue in future. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sudhir, and very impressive research. I think everybody will agree that there is always truth in the numbers, and all the difficulty is to have the numbers available and be able to make this analysis that you've made. So I think that Brownbag after Brownbag on the Asian transport outlook, we really see our instrumentalities in all this analysis. Before opening the floor for questions, so it's interesting to see that there are good news. Not only good news, but there are good news and good stories, as you mentioned. Trends compared to the projection that we've made 10 years ago, particularly on car ownership, we are not there, so we are lower than expected, which is good news. Even the trends on the modal shift, we had targets, but there were also scenarios where the modal shift would decrease and road and car, personal car will dominate. That's not the case. So I think it may be considered as an achievement also that it became stable over the period. The difficulty may come from the fact that all the targets that have been set, including the SDGs, are very ambitious. And so I think we're all expecting and waiting for your conclusion. And the conclusion is, yes, the gaps are still there, and everything that is being done sees and demonstrates some result, but it's still not sufficient to meet those. And thank you again for this. I'm sure that we have a lot of questions in the audience. So raise your hand and ask your question. I can see in the chat box that Mukund, you had some question. Maybe Mukund, instead of having me reading your question, would you like to open your mic and ask your question to Sudhir?
Thank you, Bertrand, and thank you, Sudhir, for such a wonderful presentation. A lot of facts, which gives us an insight into the transport outlook and the future. So really commendable research work done and brought to us. So thank you for that. I had just a couple of thoughts which I would like to raise here. First is the mention of decreasing motorization trend, specifically with respect to cars. But however, there is an increasing trend with respect to the two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So one question which would normally, very naturally arise these days is that is there a sort of a classification we can have or a distinction we can have in terms of EVs and ICEs? So is there an increase in EVs in terms of the total motorization happening and the total motorization trend? That also sort of has a secondary question in terms of reduction in the growth of buses. So what is the reason? Is a transition phase, from ICEs to EVs one of the reason why we are not having buses? And is there a likelihood that once we have some sort of a stable technology in Asia, leaving alone maybe China, because China is one country which has I think the largest number of EV vehicles, including buses. So probably that could be a reason. So maybe just a thought that what exactly is the reason that despite urban transit demand being increased, we are not having commensurate increase in the number of buses, because I think buses that way are more point to sort of more amenable to the demands in the urban sector rather than the rail transits, which are basically point to point. Second second thought was on the freight, where Sudhir, you mentioned that the growth in freight has been more or less constant. So whatever growth happened in the last 10, 20 years, likely to remain the same. Do we have info on in terms of what is the lead? Because freight which you showed was million ton kilometers. So is it so that the volumes are rising and the leads are decreasing? If leads are decreasing, that is a very good trend, because probably we are seeing that the market is coming nearer to the demand, so there is a less of transport requirement, which is good that way. Or is it that we have not been able to capture the unorganized sector in the freight, which is again could be a very large amount and maybe not always amenable to documentation or capture in some of the countries? Yeah, so I'll stop here, and thank you again for such a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Mukund. In terms of, I'll start with the freight one because we see a very interesting trend. If you look at the amount of time which is required to reach the main port in different countries, and this is not in the outlook, but what we saw here is the size of the geography doesn't necessarily impact the time required to reach the main port or the airport. So what we are seeing is that even the bigger countries like India have, in terms of the connectivity, have actually improved the connectivity to an extent that leads are not necessarily play a major role here. But it's just that the GDP per capita has reached a stage in Asia where majority of the countries are moving towards the, in terms of the economic structure, they are shifting towards the industrialization and massive manufacturing, which is happening in Asia. If those trends hold true, and if China again still continues in the same trend, we will see radical increase in the freight activity. But it all depends on how the post-pandemic era and how the Ukraine war plays out. If If the supply chain shifts towards if there is a near shoring or reshoring happens, then probably the freight demand will not necessarily increase that much. So there are very interesting trends on the freight side. But in terms of the lead, we think that in majority of the bigger countries, the lead is more or less the same now. It will not increase significantly in terms of the kilometers. So it is only in terms of the demand. As countries move from low income to lower middle income, there is a massive increase in the consumption patterns. And this is what is influencing the freight demand. In terms of the buses, if you look at the low-income countries in Asia, they have about 10 public transport vehicles. These are like formal and the informal sector, which is the FX and the jeepneys, 10 vehicles per capita. But as we move towards middle-income countries, this is about from 10 buses, if I remember correctly. Yeah, from 10 buses, it is about 4. So basically, there is already a decrease. And as countries become rich, historically this has happened. As countries became rich, the access has decreased in terms of the buses. The countries have not really prioritized it. But what we have seen is that Asia is learning from the mistakes made by some of the other parts of the region. But still, the focus on buses, the impact of shared mobility is something which many people are thinking about. And if you look at the estimates, still, I think many of the modelers are pessimistic with the chances of public transport vehicles. And because of that, we see a reduction in terms of the number of vehicles, of buses and public transport vehicles. But in terms of the e-buses, very interesting thought. Like if you look at China and India, basically JNNURM, and because of the Indonesian subsidies for the buses, if there is a high subsidies provided for the electric buses, there is a chance that there is a massive transition which will happen. Now, in terms of, in our outlook, we have not necessarily made a differentiation between ICE and the electric vehicles. But the projections, if you see the various projections done by different modeling groups, what we see that the first 2 modes which will completely electrify, apart from railways is the first, the second would be the 2 and 3 wheelers and the buses. And these 2 modes predominantly are the highest in Asia. More than 50% of the vehicles are 2 and 3 wheelers, and predominantly these are, and majority of this is buses. Now, in terms of the critical mass, we already see massive electrification, which is already there in terms of Vietnam. It is about, it is nearing 10%. Within the next 2 years, the electric vehicle sales in 2 and 3 wheelers will exceed 10% in Vietnam. In India, it is about 4%. It will increase within the next few years. So there is a massive transition which is happening in this. And nobody can deny that by 2030, there will be a lot of electric vehicles. Now, currently in the world, 90% of the electric vehicles are actually registered in Asia because of 2 and 3 wheelers. And we will see that same trend continuing by 2030, that massive number of vehicles will get electrified. So that transition is happening. And the good news is that car sales are not increasing as we thought 10 years back, that everybody is driving car. That is not happening, mainly because of shared mobility, because of the congestion, and because of the other factors which are there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir. And so maybe we have other questions from colleagues from other regions. I can see that we have in a group people from all regional departments, so don't be shy if you have questions to Sudhir. As you can see, he has a lot of things on his slides, but the most interesting are the answers that he can give to our questions. So I can see a question from Carlito. Would you like to ask your question directly to Sudhir?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate the very comprehensive presentation analysis. I only have one concern, is that in the estimates of, well, particularly CO2 emissions, were the emissions from the construction considered? I just wanted to relate, our experiences in rural roads, where, if I may compare this to like an iceberg, that we only see the emissions from the vehicle, but what is submerged, the larger part, is actually the emissions from the road construction. Any view?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kalito. In terms of this projections, these are basically well-to-wheel. It doesn't include the infrastructure component of the emissions. In terms of the infrastructure emissions, actually, I have done some work there. The infrastructure emissions for rural roads would be about 1 year, less than 1 year of operation emissions, which will be there. So in terms of the construction emissions, it is only a small part of the overall life cycle, what we see. What we are seeing now is, if you look at the life cycle emissions, because of the transition in electric vehicles, we see that the construction emissions start becoming, the share of construction emissions start increasing as the vehicles become more electrified. So in a net zero scenario, you would see that the construction emissions will become a major role in the total life cycle emissions from a different infrastructure component. But as long as the vehicles are the internal combustion engines, the emissions would be comparatively slow. But yes, of course, we have not really added them. What we have considered is well-to-wheel, which is basically the fuel production and the operation emissions. Basically, by consuming that fuel, how much emissions do they generate? So these are the two components. But yes, definitely, the construction emissions would play a major role going forward. And I think for ADB, which finances majority of the infrastructure construction projects, you also need to start looking at life cycle emissions from infrastructure construction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir. I hope, Carlito, it answers your question. Any other question from the group? So maybe not or not now. Maybe I have a question to you because there was a lot of knowledge, information, and analysis in this. What would be the key takeaways if you would be able to summarize this: one for road, one for rail, one for urban transport, and one for air pollution? So what would be the main take that we would like our colleagues to keep in mind from your work?
I have come to it. Yeah, it is very difficult to conclude because we are looking at multiple dimensions and we see some of the conflicting trends there. Some of the trends are contradictory to each other, but I have come to realize that glass is half full. And the reason I've been making this argument is 10 years back, 15 years back, I still remember I was in ADB in 2009, one of the transport forums there. The major highlight of that particular thing was about air pollution and how carbon emissions is increasing, air pollution is increasing. Now we have come to a conclusion that the carbon emissions at that point of time, what I projected at that point of time was, we have not reached that projection yet. We have been comparatively lower than that. So in terms of compared to then, I think we are way better. Even road safety now. A few years back, there was this projection which came out which said that globally the number of people dying on roads will increase from about 1.3 million to about 2 million. If you look at the latest, the WHO has not published their latest after 2016, the road safety outlook. But as soon as they publish it, you will realize that we are not necessarily increasing to that with that scale. So in terms of pulling back the wrong trends, I think we have done some work, but it is not at the pace or the scale which was required. So in terms of infrastructure, there is still a demand for infrastructure. There is a demand for roads, which has to be facilitated by the transport sector. In terms of the climate change, again, there is a lot of work to be done across all the sectors. So in a way, I have become a little bit optimistic now with the transport sector chances. Maybe I've become a little bit more wiser, or maybe the data what we have is we have better data now to come to that particular conclusion compared to what we had 10 years back. So in terms of access, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the connectivity, in terms of road safety, in terms of air pollution, in terms of climate change, we are seeing some progress. The progress can be intensified, no doubt about it. I'm actually optimistic that it is possible to make the change. Thank you.
Okay, that's really great to hear, because it's getting rare to hear some optimistic message like this. Of course, you're being realistic, but it's great to hear that all the efforts that have been made across the region have not been done in vain. Some battles are being won, but the gaps remain. So that would be your main conclusion. But there are reasons to be optimistic and maybe try to build on some of the successes. And I think we can also be surprised by what the numbers have to tell us, particularly on air pollution and climate change, because people may get used to the wrong idea. You mentioned that transport is not the main polluant anymore in most of the country of the region. So that's something that may be new to some of us. So that's very interesting. We still have a couple of minutes in case anybody has a question to Sudhir. We can still take one. And of course, the work on the Asian Transport Outlook is still ongoing. Most of you are familiar with it now. So that's we are now in the middle of phase 2. So Sudhir and his team are still working. So in case you want to go deeper or get further information on any of the slides or of the topic that have been covered today, please reach out to us and we'll try to address your need as much as we can. So you would like to
now the Asian Transport Outlook is online. You can actually visit asiantransportoutlook.com and download all the data you need. In case you need clarifications, you could contact us. We are happy to help. Please use the data which is there. Look at the policies, what we have. There are many interesting slides. I had only 1 hour, but actually if you look at these trends, we can go on and on with the discussions. I think very exciting data is there. We have a lot of information available. Please visit asiantransportoutlook.com and look at the data which is there. And do let us know if you need any data. If there is any data which is missing, we will be more than happy to collect that data. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sudhir, I should also mention that online we have this assessment. So it's not just the data, but we also have the analysis and conclusion. But if you need more than that or things that would be tailored to country needs or to project needs, we'd be happy to work with you. So with that, we'll conclude that Brownbag seminar. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found it as useful as possible in this context. I believe it has been very informative. So with that, on behalf of the group, I really would like to thank Sudhir for all the insights and excellent presentation and discussion. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.